pick it up in verse 21. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you," and by the way, what Jesus is doing here is he is teaching like one of the rabbis. And in that day and age, much like our own, there were famous rabbis, famous teachers. And I don't know if they went around and did scroll signings and, published and had their own Instagram and social media accounts to boost their followership. But however they did it in those days, there were certain spiritual rabbis, spiritual teachers that had a wealth of popularity among the people. And so some people would say, "I follow this rabbi," and other people say, "But I follow this rabbi," and the different rabbis would argue with each other. And it was a common technique of teaching to use this kind of rabbinical format of, "You have heard it said, but I tell you." And so Jesus here, when he introduces this statement and several others after it with this phrase, he is stepping onto the national platform and saying, "I am declaring that I am a rabbi, that I am a teacher, and I have something to say. I have something that you need to understand. I have something that you need to listen to." And so he introduces himself. He steps onto the world stage. And what the listeners at that moment could have no idea is that what Jesus was about to say would change the world. That they were listening to the man who would single-handedly, more than any other human who has walked this planet, he would change our world. That we would be talking 2,000 years later about Jesus' words. That the words in which the books in which Jesus' words were published would become the best-selling book of all time throughout the history of the world. So that's quite a pedigree for Jesus as a spiritual teacher. And we know that his words have been repeated, memorized, recited, and studied throughout hundreds of years since that first moment they left his mouth. And so here it is. Go with me now back to that first moment. He says, "You have heard it said that anyone who murders will be subject to judgment." And this is fascinating because he's not very far into his first ever sermon, and all of a sudden he's going for murder. Now, I'm a pastor and I have to prepare messages every week, but it's not often that I think, you know what I should be preaching on? Murder. And that's good probably that I'm not thinking that way, because it shows it's not like a super bad problem in my church, so I'm glad for that. But I think it's very interesting that Jesus wastes no time in his first inaugural address and goes straight for murder. And if you think he's going to make you a little uncomfortable, you're right. And if you think he's stopping there, you're wrong. Because the next thing he goes to is adultery. And he just dives right in, like he wastes no time and gets right into sex and violence and the heart of society's problems. And you know what? It may make us a little uncomfortable, but I think it gives him spiritual authenticity and spiritual authority. Because this is a spiritual teacher who is not afraid to address exactly what the issues are. He dives right into the deepest issues immediately. He wastes no time and he says, here's what we've got to tackle. There are some serious problems in this world, and I'm going to confront them, and we're going to talk about them, and we're going to do something about them. I remember listening to a preacher. He was planting a church, maybe 10 years ago in the city of Detroit. And he was not from Detroit, but he said God had put on his heart that he plant a church. And so he began praying, Lord, where should I plant a church? Where do you want to send me? Where should I go? And as he was praying, the conviction grew stronger and stronger. I want you to plant a church. I want you to plant a church. And he just said, Lord, you show me where and I'll go. And all of a sudden, the Lord showed him a ghetto in Detroit. Now, I like Detroit. I was born actually not far from Detroit. I root for the Detroit Lions, Detroit Red Wings, all of this. But even I don't really want to take a church in Detroit. And I can say this because I'm not in Detroit, and I hope nobody from Detroit watches this. No offense. But I also know that there are some real challenges, especially in some of the tough and roughest parts of that city. And we could say the same for any of our major cities, but the point was, he felt called to go to a specific place where he knew poverty was high, unemployment was high, crime was high. And so he moved his family, not knowing anyone, and he went to this suburb, this little section of Detroit that God had called him to. And he began going door to door, and he began asking people if they would like to come to church, and he began telling them about his vision to have this church. And as he started this church, he then began to preach, and people started to come, and he began to offer hope, and he began to offer these teachings of Jesus. And he felt compelled because of this sermon that he had to do something about the crime in the neighborhood where he was planting his church. He felt that his church should be able to make that community a better and safer and happier and healthy place. Now, unfortunately, for some of us, that's a little bit of a radical thought. Do we think of church as an organization, as an institution, as a group of people that are supposed to go and change a whole community? Do we think of ourselves as crime fighters? Do we think of ourselves as people who should help reduce criminal activity, that should help raise people out of poverty? Do we think of ourselves as instruments of healing and hope and bringing peace and answers and solutions to the ills in our society? Or do we more often think of ourselves as an escape, as a fortress, as the place where we can get away from the world and not have to deal with it? You see, this pastor who had the calling, he believed that God called him to make a difference in a community, not to pull people out of the community. He believed that when Jesus said go, that he had to extend beyond the four walls of his church. And not just sneak out of the four walls, try to grab someone and bring them in. And so he said one of the things he did as he started his church is every fourth weekend, when you showed up for church, you showed up in jeans, you showed up and you went out into the community and you did something to show the love of God in the community. They didn't have a worship, they didn't have praise or worship songs. They showed up at the church for worship, and their worship was to help the people in the community. And as he got to know the community, he got to know the problems. And he says they got to know where all the drug houses were and the drug dealers. They got to know where prostitution took place and what corners men could go to find that thing. And so they set up bands of people. And this is what they did, and this blew my mind. He set up a band of 12 people whose ministry would begin at 11 p.m. They would show up at church. Most of them were men. He made sure he had some strong men. And they would go and they would walk the streets all night long. And they would talk to the prostitutes. They would talk to the drug users. They would ask them what their needs were. They would ask them if they could pray for them. They would ask them if they wanted to come to church, if they wanted to join a small group. And they would walk the streets all night when the crime was happening and be talking to the people who were submersed in this world. And guess what? These people started coming to church. These people started getting into drug rehab programs. The crime in his neighborhood in 1 year went down 50% because of that church. And as he was giving this presentation and I was listening and he was just speaking with such passion, and now it was like 5 years in and the whole neighborhood that he had built his church in had changed, and his church was drawing like 500 to 700 people, some coming just from the suburbs because they wanted to see, they saw a church that was living and active and making a difference, and money was pouring in, and it was just an amazing experience of what God was doing when they did what God asked them to do. But he said this statement near the end of his testimony. And it's a statement I'll never forget. And he says, you know, in church we love to kind of whine and moan and bemoan the condition of the way our communities are or the way the world is. We love to point out the sinfulness of the world. We love to point out all the terrible things happening in the world, and let's not be part of that, and so glad we're not part of that. But he said, you know what? If there's darkness in your community, if there's drugs, if there's prostitution, if there's crime, if there's this, if there's all these sinful problems happening in the community where your church is, if there's darkness, then the problem, he said, is you. Because Jesus said you are to be the light of the world. And he said, last I checked, when light shines, there is no darkness. When light shines, there is no darkness. I never forgot that. It's easy to complain about the problems. It's easy to say, oh, my neighborhood's going to pot and I think this is happening and all these terrible people. And it's easy to say they are the problem. They are the problem. Those people, they're involved in this kind of stuff. They're bad people. They're evil people. They're whatever. I got news for you. They're people. They're people like you and I that need a Savior. And so Jesus challenges us, and he takes on violence in the first thing that he says here. He says, you have heard it said, do not murder. Anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, okay, what is Jesus going to tell us? That anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. You know, some of the angriest people I've ever met are Christian. But of course, it's always righteous indignation. But I kind of laugh about that because is there really any other kind of indignation? Does anybody ever say, well, I have some unrighteous indignation? No, whenever we're mad, we think we're justified, right? Our indignation is always justified. Can you believe they did this to me? Can you believe this is happening? Can you believe this is happening in our world? And they want this, and they, and this, and that. And we're always outraged. We live in a culture that loves outrage, and Jesus stops it in its tracks. And he says, I know you think you're fine because you haven't killed anybody. But let me show you where you're not. Because when you're angry at someone, in that anger is a wish to harm them, is a wish to get rid of them, is a wish that they didn't exist, and that can easily grow. I don't think any murder is committed without some anger at the beginning. You say, well, Pastor, couldn't someone be paid to murder? Or aren't there other reasons to murder? Yes, but I can also tell you, unless our heart is corrupted by anger and hurt and desire for vengeance, I don't think any of us, outside of that sinful corruption, could actually take someone's life. It takes a level of woundedness, of brokenness, of pain for us to get to that point where we could actually harm our fellow man. And Jesus knew that. And Jesus says, let me tell you, it's not just about not killing someone. Like that's so the very bottom baseline of human decency. Well, he's a good person. I don't think he's ever killed anyone. Okay, good. Glad that hasn't happened. But that doesn't mean that he treats people right. It doesn't mean that his words give life. It doesn't mean that he has forgiven. It doesn't mean that he's able to support and help and encourage. It doesn't mean that he is able to see somebody for the precious child of God that they are. You see, when Jesus attacks violence, he attacks it at the heart. Because that's where it all starts. That's the beauty of the gospel message. That's the beauty of the good news. When Jesus is teaching, he is always teaching to the heart. Because if he gets your heart, he gets everything else. If he gets your heart right, he gets everything else. And there are some of us that haven't committed murder, but we are murderers by nature. There is so much pain and anger. There's so much desire to get even with that certain someone. I was trying to think as I was studying this week, what would our world be like if we followed this one teaching of Jesus? If whenever anger arose and we started to feeling hate towards another fellow human, or maybe it's towards another group of humans, when that hatred arises within us, if we took Jesus' words seriously and we nipped it in the bud and we said, no, they are children of God. They are loved by my Creator. They are just as much worthy of his love and grace as I am, and I am not worthy, and they are not worthy, and so I have to love them because my Father says they're his children, and that makes them my brothers and sisters. What would happen to our world if we adopted Jesus' teaching? You know what's sad? I don't even think I can imagine it. I was trying to imagine it, and it just wouldn't even seem real. Like, we watch the news every day. Every day there is violence. Every single day, people are killed, bombs go off, people are robbed or mugged or beaten, or children are abused, or spouses are abused. The level of violence in our world, it so permeates it that we almost don't even think about it anymore. And I wonder if for Jesus, being the Son of God, being sinless, that when he stood in our world, it was just so offensive to see how easily violent we are all the time. It's just part of life. We just accept it. Not only that, we make shows and movies about it. It's just everywhere. Violence, violence, violence. I don't know what your life has been like, and I certainly hope you have never been abused or had some act of violence against you, but I know you live in this world, so the chances are actually sadly high that something has happened to you at some point. And I want to tell you right now, that was, first of all, never God's wish for you. Jesus tried to put an end to violence. His teaching, if it's followed, puts an end to violence. Nobody will use and abuse another person if they follow the teachings of Jesus. And by the way, if you're in a relationship, and I stumble on this every once in a while, if you're in a relationship where someone is using the Bible to abuse you, using the Bible as a weapon, using the Bible to support their abusive behavior. And let's just be honest here. I've seen men who claim, I'm the head of my household and I can treat my wife however I want. Oh, but except you're going to have to answer to God because there's one above you. You're not the head. Jesus is the head. He is the head of all, and we answer to him, and he says, if there's even anger in your heart, you need to deal with that. You need to confront it. And I want to say I'm sympathetic to some who were abused as children and then find it hard as adults not to have that same behavior to others, because that's all they know. And when it's the worst for us as kids, because when we're children, it gets put into us. It's that pattern of behavior is instilled in us, and that's the way we look at the world, and that's the way we operate. But let me tell you something, you don't have to stay in those patterns. Jesus is telling you how you can be free. And the only way you can be free is to reach all the way down into that heart level, go all the way to the core and rip it out from there. And then you can be a new person. As we discussed in our sermon last week, unless you are born again, this is part of that born again process. I am not doomed because of my family. I do not have to continue the violence of my family. I do not have to continue in the patterns and the destructive ways of my family. I can be different. I can be a change agent. I have the power of the gospel in my life. I have the power of the Holy Spirit, the power of the Almighty God. They can do something in my life starting at the heart level, and I can be a new person. Now, it may not happen overnight. You may have to work at this. You may even want to go to therapy. You may need to join a small group. You may need to go to anger management classes. Whatever you can get to help you. But Jesus is challenging you, and he's saying, listen, it's not just because you haven't killed them, it's your attitude. And if your attitude is not right, you're just as in much danger of hell as if you've done it. So wake up. You can't tolerate this. You have to choose. And Jesus said, I'm not going to force you. God doesn't come and make us all perfect people and take away every thought and every desire we have. He says, you have a choice. I've created you in my image. You have a choice. And so we have a choice what we are going to do with this pain, this hurt, and this anger. And so I'm calling on you as an individual. I don't know what you've been through, but there's healing. I don't know what you've been through, but there's help. I don't know what you've been through, but you can change. And I just want to speak for a moment to those who have been the victims of violence. You know, I was listening to a podcast a while back, and the episode was all about men. So good podcast for me to listen to, I thought. And they were talking about it, and as they got into the podcast, I realized, this is not exactly what I had bargained for. I didn't really look at what the podcast was about, but I had been recommended to me. And they start sharing all these statistics, and I don't remember each one of them, but what I did remember, and I know is true, is that almost all the violence committed in our world is primarily by men. Rape, by men. Domestic abuse, by men. Child abuse, by men. And the podcast host, as he's going through all these statistics and doing kind of this exploratory study on the male mindset and the male behavior, he said, it's kind of sad. I think if our world was run by women, we'd be in a lot better shape. And I thought about it, and I think he's right. It is men that are always doing this. Why are we the perpetrators? And I just want to say to all the women who have been the victims of some of this violence or bad behavior or sexual abuse or whatever it may be, I am so sorry. I don't know what's going on with men, but we have got to do better, men. And I don't think all men are bad, and I don't even think some men who do some of these things are what we might say bad, but man, there's a problem here. This is serious. This is unacceptable. We have to take Jesus' words seriously, and I want to challenge every male listening to my voice. We have to take Jesus' words seriously because the change starts with you and me. And if we don't do something, we are going to continue to hurt our loved ones, to destroy our world, to continuate this violence that is within our world. And none of us wants to live in a scary world where our life's in danger, where we could be victimized at any time. So it starts with us. It starts by looking in the mirror and saying, God, you're going to have to help me. Help me deal with these angry thoughts. Help me deal with this pain. Help me deal with these hurts. God, maybe I need to talk to someone about this. God, maybe I need to join a small group. God, maybe I need to do something to get some help so that I can deal with these things in a healthy way. You see, anger itself is not the sin, but what you do with it makes all the difference. Anger serves a purpose. Every emotion God gave us is a good emotion. Every emotion is there for a reason. And anger does warn us when our rights are being violated and when we need to stand up for something. But anger also, when it's channeled into the pain and hurt, it can do a lot of damage and cause pain that can last for generations. And Jesus goes on to say a very similar thing in verse 27 of Matthew 5. You have heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you, so we know, here's the baseline, you really shouldn't commit adultery. But I'm going to tell you something even more. Anyone that looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her where? In his heart. And that's what Jesus is getting at, and that's the genius of his teaching. It is all about the heart. Wouldn't it be great if you could have a new heart so that when these things arise, you can easily deal with them, set them aside, and these emotions do not have to control you? I think when emotions go wrong, they become so overpowering that we don't know how to handle them. We don't know what to do with them. And that can be for lust, that can be for anger. It could be for other emotions too. And I don't think Jesus left out other things because he's just getting to two of the most powerful and two of the things that do the most damage in our society. There are healthy ways to express anger. There are healthy ways to have passion and sexuality. But Jesus is saying, if you're fostering these unhealthy, sinful ways, beware. You know, just a few chapters later when Jesus is teaching, he'll tell this very pivotal parable. In fact, I really think it's one of his key parables, and it's emphasized in all three of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's this parable of the sower. And he says there's this farmer that went out and he's throwing this seed. You remember the parable, right? He's throwing the seed and it lands on different types of soil or in different places. And in one place it's kind of rocky, so it doesn't take root and the seed can't grow. In another place there's like weeds, and the weeds grow up all around it and the good seed gets choked out by the weeds. In another place it's so rocky and hard, and then there's weeds, and then there's birds. That's another one. The birds will come, swoop in, and take it. Oh, and another place, it's shallow soil. And so it grows up, but it can't get enough roots. And the minute any kind of bad weather comes, the plant is killed because it's not strong enough. But then there's one group of seeds that falls on good soil. And in that good soil, Jesus says, the plants grow up and they get strong and they survive and they thrive. And not only that, they themselves give out more seeds, 60 to 100 times fold. And what's so fascinating about that parable is when the disciples come to him later and say, what's this parable all about? Jesus says, the soil is your heart. The soil is your heart. And why would he teach this parable if it's not to show us we have a choice as to what grows in our hearts? We have a choice at what we will let be planted in our hearts. Now, like I said, we can't control a lot of things as we're children. And so there may be some seeds that were planted in you as a child that have grown, seeds of weeds and strong plants that you don't want there. And I've got good news for you too. God is the master gardener. He can weed out. He can make that soil so good that you will thrive, that the good things in this world, the good things of Jesus' kingdom, they will be planted, they will grow, they will mature, they will get stronger, so that they're so strong that there'll be no room for any weeds to grow. And when I look at Jesus teaching here on sex and violence, I recognize that what he's doing is he wants your heart to be right. He wants you to plant the good seeds. And he wants to warn you. Because if you let some of these seeds of anger and lust grow, they might be small now, but they can get bigger and stronger. And the more you fertilize them, the more you think about them, the more you cherish them, the more you get caught up in the emotion of it, it could lead to something even unimaginable. As a pastor, I can't tell you how many times I've had people sit in my office and collapse in tears saying, I don't know how it happened. I don't know how it happened. Well, Jesus is giving us a clue how it happened. It happened because a long time ago, there was a seed planted. You know what might be nice? Maybe if I had this, or maybe if I could get revenge, or maybe if I could have a relationship with this person, even though they're not my spouse. They seem really neat and they're really friendly. And that little seed can grow into something till you're sitting in my office saying, I don't know how it happened. And Jesus is warning us. I'll tell you how it happened. He said, because when it first arose, you didn't stop it. Because when that weed first started growing, you didn't pull it out. And any of you that are into gardening, you know it's much easier to get the weed when it's small, right? And some of these weeds, and I've had to do my fair share of weeding in life, some of these weeds, once they get pretty big, man, you have to get the shovel. I had some bushes I wanted to take out of my garden. I couldn't get them out for anything. You know how I had to get them out? Well, I did it a very manly way. I got the pickup truck. I put a chain around the tow hitch and put a chain around the bottom of the bush. And even then, when the pickup truck hit the gas and it pulled on the bush, the whole truck kind of lurched and almost stopped. Before then, the bush was ripped out of the ground. Jesus said, how much easier to stop the weed before it grows. So you don't have to get to that point. Now, if you're already at that point, let me tell you, Jesus has got the truck, he's got the chain, he can change your life. It's not too late. Don't let the devil tell you you can't change. Don't let the devil tell you you can't find forgiveness. Don't let the devil tell you you can't live a new life. You can. But to the rest of us, who think maybe just a few seeds aren't a big deal, who think just a little bit of anger, I mean, they really aren't that great of a person, who think a little bit of lust is probably just fine, I want to encourage you, read the words of Jesus. And he ends it this way. He says, you know what? If your right eye causes you to sin, verse 29, it's better to gouge it and throw it away. For it's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. How serious is Jesus about this? He's pretty serious. And my fear is that we as Christians don't take him that seriously because our world is so filled with it that it just seems normal. But God is calling us into his kingdom. And in his kingdom, there is no violence, there's no abuse, there's no murder, there's no robbery, there's no rape, there's no sexual abuse, there's no child abuse. There is none of these horrific evils that plague our society that have become the norm. And I want to live in his kingdom, don't you? That's the world I want to be part of. And he's calling you and I to that, and he says, listen, even if you had to, now he's not saying to actually do it, okay? But even if you had to give up a piece of your body to get there, it's so much better in my kingdom. It would be well worth it. Don't let sin take root. Don't choose it. Don't foster it. Don't nurture it. Cut it off at the source. When that seed, when that thought arises, it's not wicked to have a thought. It's not a sin to have a thought. But when the thought comes in, you can choose what to do with that thought. And so God is calling you to a new way of living, to a new way of thinking. Because how we think about this, what we reflect on, what we meditate on, this has everything to do with what grows in our hearts. And so for this year, I want to challenge you. as we close this morning. And I'm so excited that we have a baptism because it's like the perfect symbol as this young lady gives her heart to Jesus and says, Lord, take my whole life, take my heart. You plant in there all the good things that you want to grow in my life, and so much better to do it when you're young. And I'm so excited about that. And there's no more fitting way and no more fitting appeal than this baptism at the end of our sermon. But I want to challenge you because I don't know where you're at. I don't know how much you've examined your own thoughts toward these issues. How much you've paid attention to the anger in your life. How much you've paid attention to the lust in your life. But I want you to think seriously this week about Jesus' words. I want you to meditate upon him. And I want you to pray this prayer. I want you to say, Jesus, show me when the devil is trying to plant seeds in my heart. Help me to be aware of it. Help me to recognize it. Help me to see when that anger is taking hold and I'm nurturing it and I'm fertilizing it and I'm giving it the water that it needs, that I'm meditating on that anger. And the same with lust, when that creeps in and I'm meditating on that and I'm flourishing, letting that flourish in my life. Let me remember my life is so much better without these sinful weeds. That there are healthy ways that I can connect with human beings in love, in value, and respect. That your kingdom has for me everything I need. I don't need these things. Because the lie the devil tells us is, oh no, you need these things. They'll make you happier. Now, it might be easier sometimes to let these emotions grow and to just get carried away with them, but it's not the right way. And it's never better. Even if it's easier at times. It's never better. And we don't have to look too far, and if you're not convinced on it, just talk to someone who's gone down some of these paths, and you will hear the regret and the pain that these things, because Jesus is trying to save us from that pain. He's trying to save us from that regret. He's trying to save our society from the generations of pain that can be handed down when we do not appropriately deal with sex and violence. So I praise God that he talked about these issues. I praise God that he wasn't silent on these issues. I praise God that he had a mission to eradicate these things from our society and our communities. And I pray to God that we will join him in this mission, that we will be part of eliminating these things, these damaging, painful things from our world, and that it will start with you. And it will start with me. And that our church can be a light in our community, in our world, for everything that is good and just and comes out of the heart of love. This is my prayer this morning.